Hello, everyone, and welcome to YouTube Masterclass. This is a Coursera program, and it's YouTube Masterclass, and it's used for academic purposes, for gaining credit, in college, universities, institutions. It's a film studies class, so this class is a film studies class, and to get its credits, you would have to audit and listen in if you're taking the class, and you'd have to listen to each lecture. There's 16 lectures per semester, except in summer, which is a 12 unit lecture. And by 12 units, it means you get 3 units out of it completely on your transcripts. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it all adds up. And if you're taking college to the extent that you're going beyond undergrad and going into grad school, then in grad school you want to pick up as many classes as you can. I mean, you'd be exuberant about like going for classes that way, and that way you'd have covered all that you need to know about your theory on your major on graduate major theory. And by then you're thinking about these things and you want to take this class. Well, believe it or not, there are film schools, especially in Los Angeles, and there's some in New York, and there's some other film schools throughout America that like are really intensely complex, and but they're the best ones because they put you through the absolute hardest track of going at all. Now, this film studies class is not really as challenging as it could be if it be a graduate class, but that we kind of go wherever credits needed with Coursera. Because Coursera is not just for picking up like extra credits from listening in and auditing a Coursera 16 week lecture, but it is for that duty. But like it's usually because a class had to be taught remotely. And that's why we teach everything over the YouTube master classes, that you can stay in as close to you want as to the classes at the point now. But we're pretty much picturing that like other people that are getting masterclass from this specific one. I'm Dr. Aaron Sheedy, by the way, and I it's not like we don't prepare for class, but we always look ahead to explain that in Coursera we kind of have to have the tag line that we're operating as a remote class, and that we operate as a remote class doesn't mean there isn't a final, and doesn't mean we won't have like some challenges to these lectures. And I think that's because some of the time we're not talking about just the popular cinema of now in a film class. We're usually talking about cinema in the past. And like by the past, I mean like 20 years and before, really, like is the limit we usually reach back to discuss the movies, because they're just out then, and they have a long time to go to build up the study behind them to make them like these sort of like long lasting masterpieces. And that like it's an important uh, task to locate a masterpiece once in your life, and like say this is something that's totally a masterpiece, and I'm going to call it that, but now I have to prove it with like research on the actual like artwork. And then the research on the artwork usually leads to the internet anyway. And since these classes are remotely but they're available on the internet, that works well for the Coursera audit, because all they really need, and all you would need, is the audio from this. These aren't like made up pictures to make me look glamorous or anything. Like I'm here to rein in the sort of film school ideas we have of what theoretical studies of film is like on a graduate level, but you could receive the education in your undergraduate years too. And again, I'm not saying you have to take this course. No one has to take this course. But if you want to get the credits that are connected to it, then take it. Now we're back to, and I had to go a longer version of that, would be to say that we're not like here to make necessarily friends, but we can be friends, whatever. That's what kind of concept is that? But it is for teaching the theory of films that go back 20 years and before, and the history of those films. And so, like, we talk about that to also encourage productions that are like similar to these productions, these classical ones. That makes it real artistic if they do that, like in today's labor with the artistic means of yesteryear. And so when we get into all these like auteur studies earlier in these film studies courses, and that's where the director defines what the film is like and what the film is going to, I mean, what the meaning of the film is. In other words, like the story you get out of it, and what that does for you as a story and as a explanation of how you feel. You feel exuberant about the result of the artwork. That's because the director really put his style and craft into it. And by doing that is like Citizen Kane is like the ultimate example of that with Orson Welles. And these are the films of Orson Welles class. And we went over all the films. Like we talked about them. We looked at it. We looked at the trial up and down, and Chimes at Midnight up and down. We can go through those texts and see all these complicated matters that are like stylizing it with this kind of like rigid complexity. Like he buries the text so much in Citizen Kane that it's like a dream within a dream. It's like he's dreaming his whole life back. Like he fell on the stairs and now he's dreaming his whole life back. And that's why it has to do the news on the march after he's already fallen over. And it's like he falls over dead, and then it's time for news on the march. And like these all things pick you up through his life and moments that happen later in the film that you don't necessarily like process all throughout until after the second time you come to the footage and you're like, oh, so that's what he was talking about in that news on the march thing. So it's like picking it up as though it's like a time machine, picking out the events that like it was going to show on the news on the march, and some of those actually happen or are recreated in the film. And this is a stylistic kind of mimesis of the story itself, where you have this reflection of everything needs to be realistic and everything needs to be like they're shown to me in metaphor of what it's possible to become like in the pursuit of wealth or fame or political power. And the politics of Orson Welles, they're not the same as the kind of libertarian William Randolph Hearst type politics. Those are like the everything costs money and we've got enough for it all. You know, we're just going to pay for everything and take it. And that's cool because like nobody really does that anymore on a romantic whim. Just picks up all the newspapers and garnishes them. And the thing is like I think that Orson Welles was more doing this kind of piece of artwork that was like, what happens when you make money? It was like the original plan of Citizen Kane. I'm young and I have lots of money because I'm directing, so let's make it about someone who's like has precarious riches. Even though he'll have riches forever, William Randolph Hearst. He'll have riches forever, but they'll be precarious because they'll be based on these business deals, the business deals are like crooked and they are intentionally, and he's learning that about deals that they're all crooked, and like they encourage the crooked on the deal, and that just means that they'll thwart you or they'll stop you from being able to make an income. I mean, not an income, but an import export, like an import export to another city, township, or whatever, is where we meet their trade demands and they meet our trade demands, and that's how we trade, is across the demands. And like those demands are actually forced to be made because like now you've got this whole idea that like someone is applying power to maintain the power for the powers that be. And they're always putting down that like one section of like life that's like, we don't need it because it's not industrial, or and that's when a lot of these things become like hard to understand, is like when they're doing things for cinema for the sake of cinema, like Orson Welles, for instance, as a director. It's like he's doing things for the sake of doing things, but it's the cinematic purpose. And the cinematic purpose is kind of malleable because it's like saying in one country they do things the same way as another, and they don't. Like the frames are longer, like the time it lasts on the screen is longer. You know, you watch a foreign film and like the deep focus can be even more deep focused than Orson Welles. I mean, that's who they're looking at as Orson Welles. And so I thought I'd set that picture up and say, what if Orson Welles films and all those things he did from Citizen Kane to An Unvanquished Love and F for Fake, Mr. Arcot, and, you know, what if he and Touch of Evil and all those other ones, and I mean The Stranger, we've got The Stranger, we've got, The Third Man kind of looks like an Orson Welles movie. They're always saying it's the Orson Welles movie that wasn't directed by him, but we know that they split the credits, and when they split the credits, that's how they ran it down, because Carol Reed, Oliver Reed and Carol Reed were very into the theater. I mean, they were theater goers their whole life, and they lived the theater, so it's just like, that's why he got director. But Orson Welles really did direct a lot of scenes in that. And I was going to compare and contrast for your own like informational on narratives and how narratives are conformed by storytellers that are like these auteurs, and like you just want to call the auteur the storyteller. That's kind of weird. It kind of seems like a lower name for that, but it isn't, because that's like the person that really is using the camera to tell the story. And with Preston Sturges, another director around the time of Orson Welles, and he was really around the time of Orson Welles. I mean, Preston Sturges came out with his first movie, Hail the Conquering Hero, and then he had this Miracle at Morgan's Creek. And these are funny movies. I mean, they're exaggerated in a good way. They're like done up, they're like a Norman Rockwell painting, but like if it were funny. And like it's like the Lady Eve, Palm Beach Story. There's all these good ones, and then Solon's Travels. The whole point of like Preston Sturges is to make everyone feel cheerier. Actually, like that the joke was funny enough to cheer up the mood. And like he'll go to great extent for jokes, like Choctaw Tea. I mean, like Preston Sturges goes great extent for jokes. Like he'll set one up, but that doesn't go off until 20 minutes later. And you think it's a really highly stylized type of comedy. It's just really classy comedy. I mean, even when he gets beat up in Sullivan's Travels and Sin Away, he's still coming out of it like, I still have success now that I'm on the other side. And these are very opposite. They're like optimistic enough to come out of the Orson Welles dark side camp, because the Orson Welles dark side camp is like what most cinema is: liberal, nihilistic, divisive action. It's mimicry of like extreme events, and then it's like, there's so many things about the cinema that work for the genre of these like postmodern kind of rip out films that are like the Orson Welles films. It's like everything wants to be like Touch of Evil, and it is trying to be, but no one quite really bothers to mess around with Preston Sturges either, because not only is he a contract player with like a lot of all the studios at once, he's also like important to write screenplays, not just for his Writers Guild, but like for Hollywood in general, that he's called upon to just pour them off with screenplays. And so like he already did that earlier in his career, and so it's like, well, I think Preston Sturges is kind of like unapproachable in a way because he's such a legend of comedy, and that he came into the cinema is only more optimistic than the Wells camp, in that there is optimism in a Preston Sturges film at all, and if only for the moment to joke about it. He was saying that that would be something that'd have to be indicated by the film that had happened, and that's why we're like, okay, so he can take that kind of joke on and be like this classy affair at the same time, these romantic affairs that are actually like classy, and they in other words, they have like, they're like upper class, they like have the like regality, the regalism, you know? And Orson Welles is looking at things from a very point of view of like modernism and like the destruction of the look and like how looking through the proscenium of this movie will reveal terrible things. You know, it's like War of the Worlds. It's like scary, awful, horrible nightmares will come from seeing Citizen Kane. You know, it's like in these early trailers they were like setting them up like horror movies almost. Like The Trial wasn't really a horror movie, but it kind of acted like one. It was like Total Recall. They were taking this guy through his life to see if he could remember any of this folder roll in his mind, and then suddenly it becomes this sort of like conspiracy to change his what his thoughts even meant. And I mean, you know, so you think about with Preston Sturges being this rich director and him being older than Orson Welles even, and going on till his last film, which is I know what it is, but I can't mention it right now. There's a couple of his last films that just kind of faded away and nobody saw them. But like that he had Preston Sturges. But the focus I'm indicating on is we need to take a compare and contrast of Preston Sturges to Orson Welles. And the reason why is because they were contemporaries at the time. And that they knew each other. Yeah, everybody knows each other a little bit and then doesn't know them at all, right? But like that, they never really associate one cinema with the other is the whole study we're doing on Hollywood's dichotomy of like this really classy director that's like been established as an auteur. You know, he's going on to make more comedies, Preston Sturges, and this one is Lady Eve. And so the thing is Orson Welles' camp is looking very dark and heinous and despondent because even Lady from Shanghai and everything, you keep going through it and it looks really devourous and like predatorial. Like it just seems like it's looming in this like coming of the Kubrick film later down the road, you know, and you're like, yeah, I'd like to tell you about what happens with the Kubrick story, but you'd never believe me with the Orson Welles story because the Orson Welles story is so cynical and deviated that it all goes back to William Ince getting killed, or Thomas Ince, I'm sorry, got killed on William Randolph Hearst's boat. It was one of the things that like caused Citizen Kane to be made and like to look at, but it was never in that. And the reason I say this is why would he absorb someone's story and say, like, this is the sad story of what it's like to have too much money, or this is what it's like to have too much greed, you know, and like have to take care of the world with my money, but like don't want to do anything with it but hang out all day in Xanadu, you know, and it's like he's totally like falling into this like dark hole throughout the movie, and it's like he's getting closer to where he slipped on the skate and died, you know, because it's like as he's getting closer there with the movie, the aggravation of the characters is adjusting in this sort of, you know, Christmas Carol kind of way, you know. It's like, well, that was the Ghost of Christmas Future. We're out of there, you know. But Preston Sturges, although he is cynical and he is somewhat candid about sexual cynicism, and he isn't really like the kindest guy because he's got to maintain his like cultured director among directors that everybody feels that he's great and deserves to get to do his own movies because he writes so many for other people, etc. I mean, that's what most directors that are have like these situational genre repetitions throughout their genre. And like Orson Welles' repetition is the repetition of the negation of life. That we're coming upon our death and we're seeing how we're march of the times, march of the death. Like we're going forward so we can get back to where we died. It's what always happened, you know. And this is like something he gets from radio. Orson Welles gets this from radio. But he's already in the radio scene being a total nihilist. That is, he doesn't mind if everything gets destroyed. That'll just send him to his grave quicker. You know, I mean, he would have a cynical outlook. Well, there's nothing I can do about that. So, so it's like Orson Welles gets this kind of art credit, though, for his films because he was dealing in independent films on his own means, like Preston Sturges kind of was. But Orson Welles depended on his own means at first, but eventually it became like an artistic project that everybody donated everything to. So by the time of F for Fake, he could actually have a budget for a film now. Whereas like before, he was always catching up on last film's budget, and like that isn't a bad thing in the movie industry because they still play films after they've shown in their theatrical release in venues around America, for instance. Like there's places you can go to see films that have been seen already, and that goes back to that California school like logic. We do this for USC, Harvard, and Calarts, by the way, and those are the three schools that we've definitely gone that I've gone through, and I've seen like the real data come out of there, just like what film students have a chance doing what. And so you think about, okay, well, you want to direct a film, and that's why you take film school. But I'm telling you, and directors like this know this too, is that like if you watch and study film, you'll eventually get the idea as to how to make it. Like you watch and study films so much that you're like, oh, so that, and like you're used to making it that way, and so it's like that's the way we're gonna make it, and like it'd be much easier, I think, to follow like the kind of optimism that like we're all still alive, like at a Preston Sturges story, we're all still alive, we're all still here, we're all still good natured, but that was quite a doozy of an event, or whatever it was. And so there's always some doozy event that's going on that's more exciting than everything else. And I think that Preston Sturges, even though he was kind of open about sexuality and everything, he didn't really run his controversy to an Orson Welles level. That Orson Welles is always artistic now, and that's why he's getting taken care of, is a long line of since he's been in the avant-garde medium on. He's really been trying to find these ways of putting these big productions together, like these War of the Worlds big. And he's put these big productions together so that they could linger out as like omens of time, and that they're the omen of time, and that Magnificent Ambersons takes all this credence into like kind of being more, it could have almost ended instead of a melodrama as like a Preston Sturges movie. They all go riding off with Sally of the Sawdust, right? And so there's a world of film that's being negated by Orson Welles by the time he gets to Citizen Kane. It's a modern cinema project. It's not really done. It's not really not done. It's kind of an ambiguous piece. All of Orson Welles' pieces after, and he mind you, he was 25 when he made Citizen Kane, when he was working on it. So, and he hid the film canister so they couldn't get edited, right? We talked about that, but the point is he's got these monster films that, like, even though he lost like 20, 30 films in the process of his filmmaking, like, he's still got to put out like 15 or 16 of the world's biggest changers of all time. And that's the thing about Preston Sturges, is since he was an independent director from his era, he brought that in too in the 40s. In the 40s, we'll go on with Lady from Shanghai, and Orson Welles will see The Stranger in the 40s. And by the time it all comes out for like Orson Welles to make something more controversial even the next time than his previous controversy, is kind of why he's going for this cynical angle. Like Orson Welles is kind of like, because he doesn't want it to get so fresh that it's remembered every time, or like something to emotionalize about. Because I think that you can emotionalize off of aestheticism. They say not to, because if you're emotionalizing off of aestheticism, then that means that like you need cured with a piece of good looking art. So like if you look up at your good looking art, suddenly your mood's okay. Well, we'll give you that eccentricity, but you see what I'm getting at. Like if someone were to say, well, like, the reason I feel better now is because that movie was aesthetically correct, I'd give you that. I'll give you that. You know, you want a movie to look a certain way with the editing, and even Citizen Kane uses, even with longer takes, uses, and that's what we mean by editing, is how long the take is between each take. And so when you're lapsing to montage and you're going, this is the what direction of the film. Remember that Orson Welles has got this epic, but it's like also an experimental film. So it gets technical on the artistic range, and the theatrical range is totally covered by Wells. He's got the theatrical impetus all the way down, so they're like, well, give him what he wants then. So he's got the theatrical impetus of how to make a film project itself, basically. Then he's going in, and then he gets involved with all these scenes in the 40s, and like they're pushing him to be darker and to be more sinister and to put out these films that are like, as far as I know, The Trial all the way to that. I mean, from Citizen Kane, The Trial, and then of course Touch of Evil. And Touch of Evil is 1959, and it's like 1958, and it's really like a beautiful dream of like being trapped on the border with the cast of Psycho. And I'm not really saying that's a bad thing. I'm actually kind of joking, but Touch of Evil is such a horror film that like they brought all the favorite horror film favorites back. And what's funny about that is Psycho was made after. We always discuss that, and then they're like, yeah, but Psycho is actually bringing back the cast of Touch of Evil. And we'll never know because they came out around the same time and they probably took different time tracks to make. The time track being where the film actually exists in the historical setting of where it exists. And so if Orson Welles was providing this sort of dark nightmare of this, like not even of escape, of like absolute destruction that would destroy all men, and it was even his hope for love. And while cynicism is a trademark to these not so sugar coated movies of Orson Welles, it still seems as though he isn't in bad nature about it, in terms of like he doesn't cut off the whole world from the ideas that he has. And Preston Sturges has ideals too, and these sort of utopian views. And again, these are political things that are particular to these directors, not necessarily like saying what politics should anyone have is a really bad idea. You can't really say, looking back, that that person's politics could have changed and they could have been better at something. You could say that, but that'd be like presumptuous to think that they hadn't got their politics straight and they're like practically running these political movies. So if like Orson Welles can run a political film, I think we're okay to have petition and like potential libel almost. Like if you can put it in a film, it's to represent something that represents the thing we're thinking of. See, it's not like saying that the character Citizen Kane is William Randolph Hearst and everything else following is going to be the story of William Randolph Hearst. That was the basic skeletal process of the film, was to be like this version of the William Randolph Hearst story, but this totally eccentric, controversial version. And so that's what they're making, and Orson Welles, he's getting really small on some of the takes and really leads with these like long shots and does all these editing techniques with dissolves. There's really dissolves or really blasting off throughout the film. And what I used to like watching about Citizen Kane once a year was how it definitely changes as a timeline on a film, because like you can watch the same exact version and I swear the timeline still has a way of changing. And it's not just because there's hundreds of versions of these films. It's that this film became important enough to study as a textual medium because it was said that we should study the ones that are complex so we can see all the significant details that went in to creating like one big movie, and that he's hoisting these movies with his own canon isn't as true for Preston Sturges, who's now probably later is like making less than Orson Welles, are making about the same because pay could only be so big. But this is around the time of the end of the Blacklist, so it's like it's about the end of the Blacklist. But they say that was with Spartacus, but there were other movies that were coming out that were shuffled all around. And fortunately for Alfred Hitchcock, he had his planned ahead of time. I don't know how he knew, but no, I'm kidding. So, so really, we're looking at two different directors, Preston Sturges and Orson Welles, that made it at the same time, but like their level of star power was on their own by themselves, that they made up in front of the cameras so that they would know that they're like not just an actor, they're a writer, they're not just a writer, they're directors, and that Preston Sturges kind of fortunately goes off into this sort of optimism zone that like that was still funny even though bad things are kind of happened, but then it's like with Orson Welles it's like from bad to worse and here we go. It's like we're already sure that the ethics are going to be like Broken Blossoms, where they totally spend one out on us and just be like, ha, we told you guys that you were going to get wrecked with this one. We told you guys you get wrecked. Touch of Evil is quite a wreck waiting to happen. I mean, that there's a exploding car at the beginning and it's kind of used as like a joke because like it's set up as though the 8 minutes that the time bomb is going to take are being seen through the eyes of those supposedly, but they're actors, in those roles. And that by the time the car explodes, at the end of that, you're like, well, I didn't see that coming. I did see that coming. I saw that coming. And so Preston Sturges will set up these jokes kind of in a different way because he's saying that like the optimism of being funny is just what it is in and of itself. It's like a laughter as a kind of, it's like if you diverted from your original goal and went down the path of Preston Sturges and it made you funny, laugh because this one time you don't have to remember any of the other details. You're just remembering what's funny. And I know this sounds vague, but it's like I know Preston Sturges kind of sets up a comedy like it's becoming the very like biological nature of the film is to turn it into a comedy with him around, with the actors and actresses he had around. These are movies that are reminding you of the American spirit, but they're kind of offensive in their like proclivities. Like they're kind of offensive in saying like, well, someone can fall in love with a woman, a man can fall in love with a woman can love a man, and that is possible. And this is like presumption that only like Hollywood would love to devise, and that like Hollywood really didn't count Orson Welles out of the club, and they didn't really like count him in as far as like other directors had been. Not really so much Preston Sturges. They got about awarded the same amount because they were independent guys, so they would go back to their own camp of filmmaking or their own look at filmmaking. This is similar to them, and they would see the ways in which they could do another film like that or theater. They were both in the theater really profusely. And it was like, of course, Orson Welles always did those plays like Macbeth where it's like dark and dreary and falling apart and everybody's mad and ghosts are coming to kill people. And yeah. But The Lady Eve by Preston Sturges at least has enough comedy to say this couple, it's a screwball comedy because you're like, this couple could get married after hanging out, and at first they thought they'd never like each other, and then they just kind of fell in each other's favor. And so I don't think that it's really too reasonable to say that either one of those careers was a failure. No, there weren't failures as careers. It's just that there's even a higher echelon of filmmakers that were making films how they wanted to make them and were promoting the study of artistic stylization. There were directors from John Ford to Sam Peckinpah that made the westerns of the time, and around in 1945, you have that terrible moment with John Ford where it's like the one scene where they're tributing to Custer, and you're like, this is awful. Why would they be tributing to Custer? And so then you're like looking at it later, and you're like, but that the characters were making fun of the whole concept of Custer in general was pretty apparent. Like in Fort Apache, you notice that they totally they bolster him up like Custer, he's the greatest. And they're saying that facetiously, but you never find that out just by watching the movie. And this is the problem with Hollywood classical cinema. You're trying to make like a fearsome, free fighting joke or whatever, and it turns it into like this libation that suddenly we're supposed to really look back and think that Custer was a great guy. And I'm like, that doesn't really work for this Western. That's kind of dated. I don't know if I put that there, but it's there with this encapsulation of saying they're fucking kidding, dude. Like they're not, but they're not like with the film though, because Hollywood is like we're taking it anyway and stuffing it like a goose down everyone's throat. And I'm not saying that this is really the bad thing or good thing about the effect of that film, but one thing that is interesting is Fort Apache does have Native Americans that are really in that film. So I wouldn't like botch too far ahead that they didn't want to do it either, because if you look at things on the surface of the director, his career was already augmented. He could do what he wanted, and he was doing westerns, John Ford. And then you come all the way to the modern Sam Peckinpah, and now you've got some kind of like adrenaline that was from a Orson Welles movie kind of. You feel this like Don Siegel like move from Orson Welles and like Touch of Evil where they're running around with that cassette tape, reel to reel player, and he's trying to chase him down as he's like recording his audio. Like that is as precarious. Excuse me. That's as precarious as any other stunt you could pull in the devise of Touch of Evil. And Touch of Evil has kind of these strange feelings of like not everything is what it's supposed to mean and not everything is right. And you kind of get the light shown right in your face and Touch of Evil, and then you kind of like come out of the interrogation chamber and you're like ready to talk about it. But the Preston Sturges litters on his own idea that you can do an idea in different ways forever, because the real fact is he does an idea in different ways, and Orson Welles movies show up differently each one because they're either with a different studio or it's with a different project he had to abandon, or it's, which is a lot, two-thirds of almost all he made got abandoned. It's a really hard career to say, man, we gave him all he was worth, because you look back and he had a lot of projects that he started dying. I don't really think that all of them went to roost, but his projects that he did not make factor in a lot of what cinema still has to offer us in terms of where we need to research the next idea we make for a film. And here's we go, as filmmakers, we say, well, we've learned all these effects from Orson Welles. We like the dreary, the dark, the magnificent Emerson's, like we'll all slide away into like obscurity, but we're all famous anyway because we're in this film, and films make us famous. Commentary is all through it. And in Orson Welles, it just takes this nihilism where it's like, that doesn't matter, nothing matters anymore, and now nothing matters anymore ever again is kind of what you get with the spool out of the nihilism. Well, that didn't matter. But then with Preston Sturges, you kind of get this like sacrilege at first, and then democratic, sacrilegious, democratic, and then it sort of takes you to this like kobold of comedy. It's like this intermittent what is it? The comedy is the it's not vaudevillian. It's an action comedy. It's an action comedy that the comedy happens in action is similar with the silent era and the silent clowns and like Chaplin and Keaton and Harold Lloyd, how they would do cinematic jokes a lot of times were in these movies like The Lady Eve, that there were a lot of different vying powers of cinema when these movies came out, and that they were towering infernos, so to speak, of getting the project done before the other studio releases theirs is how they were competitive. They would always try and be the first studio with the film out. Now, I don't know what studios today, if they want it to be the first one out or stall on it. I don't know enough about the background with that. I know that if a filmmaker were to approach a project now, because Orson Welles losing so many of his, they'd probably get theirs done on the outset of being like, well, this sounds like a really cool independent movie that like they should fund some real funding into, because it looks like kind of like an Orson Welles nihilistic movie, you know, and that like we all get excited about the idea that like everything comes to an end and everything comes to a stopping point, and that Preston Sturges kind of narrowed his down on the railway of writing scripts forever. And he was having this real, like, Barton Fink kind of moment where it was like all things are screenplays. And so he did his last few pieces on how screenplays were parodying themselves as screenplays by, like, showing the script to the movie in the movie that you're watching, you know. I was like, but it seems like it's a different script, and you don't realize it's on such an obscure scene that you can't even think back to what scene that was unless you're in the film, because then you've seen all of the things recorded so many times from different angles that you'll be able to pretty much macrocosm, like, understand the story. Like, you'll be able to understand the story of a film if you see every shot of it, like, a few seconds. So that's why it's a good idea when you're doing interviews with someone that is is in the film business or is in the music business or something. You have to plan ahead of time and have like a journalism degree and things to do that. I mean, you shouldn't just go interviewing someone haphazardly. But this class is saying that, like, if you got to get into that study eventually, because the people that were in the movie can remember what the movie was about most because they saw the shots be tagged that small. And so that's what all interviewers of, like, critical studies are really going for, is, like, what the movie might have looked like in some other circumstance. And you're like, well, don't parade someone with that question, but yeah, that is a good question, because then you're like, we can really compare to how they narrowed down with the stylistics of this movie to the point that they're using Orson Welles' deep focus long takes. That by the time of Lady from Shanghai, there's all these like cubist work, and there's all this like Dickens, and there's like this feeling that like everything's gonna end up dead, and then like we're all getting together to figure out how we like defeat death, and nobody's even seen death or heard death, but they know it's coming, you know. And that could have been Orson Welles returning to the set, and they were just screaming that. No, I'm kidding. It probably was. You know, he's like, I just lost 2 movies. I'm feeling really pissed. You know, it's like, we understand that you're stressed, Mr. Wells. And then it goes back into that whole like clusterfuck that is Citizen Kane, you know. With a movie, it's like everything is on the edge. It's like we just played scene 1, scene 5 came next, scene 9 came next, and then we went back to 4 and 8. You know, it's like that's how they edit a real movie anyway, but now he's got to extra take care of the editing. And actually, these things kind of play out into scenarios, these scenes. You know, there's sonography. It's like the way this shot is supposed to look is the way the image gives it. And that's still kind of Hollywood-like, because if it's the way it looks and it's the way he's saying it looks and the way he demanded it look originally when he brought it to the table, and this is what he wants to be in the movie. And so you can actually feel the hand of Orson Welles like move like, what is it, the trial. He's like moving along through the trial. He's like, you can feel his hand like on this pinboard saying, let's go that way, let's go that way. You know, it's like this abstract space where you're, on a mission to do something, but at the same time, you can't go anywhere because everybody's out to get you. So you don't have like freedom to move around. So like the paranoia in the trial is this sort of like reconcile of like the dark side of emotion and the dark side of how we feel when cloistered in on like our own things are coming after us from all sides, and we feel like yelling what they do in the trial. And it's like, leave me alone. What did I do to deserve this? Or he's like, I'm in a trial that I never caused, and no one knows why it exists, but I have to go through it. It's these metaphorical trial idea that gives me the feeling that Orson Welles was really running with the Kafka, just like delivering it like in this sort of powerful way. And that movies are a powerful way to give away some piece of knowledge. And back to politicism, it's like, well, the piece of knowledge and the politicism are interesting facts that'll be like lingering in the movie, but the movie can't advance based on ethical ideal concealment of what something is. I don't know. Epic ideal, like movie shot, movie picture, things you want to see in a movie like this, whether it's down and depressing. And the down and depressing comes right from the Citizen Kane camp, but that it's such a powerful movie, it's really not depressing. It's more of uplifting that you even see someone live through all that. When you see someone live through all that, you kind of say that's a rare experience to understand them as a person. I don't even feel like the film's dissing him anymore. Because anybody could have that line of stress and then later say, well, the film is a little cynical. But it isn't really. Like, it actually has, like, comedy in it and, like, some weird parts with, like, jazz circles. And it has these, like, horses that ride into a studio and these, like, penthouse chicks on top of them. And, it's like, I mean, Orson Welles does it up. When he gets whatever way he can get, he takes every last bit of the money and uses it for some spectacle in Citizen Kane until he's out, and then he just regenerates when Citizen Kane makes money. And now of course that RKO produced Citizen Kane, and everyone perennially they love Citizen Kane. It always comes in as the best film ever made by everybody, like they're always saying that. And there's so much more to it we could study. I mean, like, there's been like 5 or 10 studies on that just in other books about that book. And I'm saying it's going to take like 20 more to figure it out. So, the last thing that I'll say in this strange compare and contrast of directors we didn't really think of going at the same time, but that Orson Welles and Preston Sturges must have been in correspondence with their theatricality, but that they're in 2 separate worlds, and you can see how the diegesis of the world of a film is defined by the creative runner of the film. That, like, Orson Welles is going to be it's his process, his thought process, that's going to be the importance in where the camera goes, where the actors are and related to that, and what's being heard, everything that's being captured in the background. It all has to coincide with also a match on action, let's say, with, like, it has to coincide with the next shot, and the shot coincides with the next shot, and that's how they edit it. They take it to the frame that they coincide together, and snip, snip, they put that over, and then they do something else in the second set because they're not connected to the first set anymore. And it gets, so then you would have to go scribbaging through film and looking for more pieces. But I think that Orson Welles and Preston Sturges were way ahead of the game. They had their production mode so traditional quality in a way that they could slam through it and make them modern. That Preston Sturges is more of a classicist. You can tell that he's more of a neoclassicist, not just in his optimism, but in his determinism of, like, human love being actually a strength of a human form, not like a curse. And so we take upon ourselves the curse of Preston Sturges. If we should go comedy, that should be a narrow it down, find the way to reveal the joke. The joke's there, but you have to reveal it by like stripping away at it. Or you can take the Orson Welles approach, which most people nowadays do, even independent or not, and that is dark, dreary, cynical, lonely, isolated, problematized, illegal, and things in the film that are still controversial, and that it never fades in controversiality, and that's what must be why Citizen Kane began with early in the film. Citizen Kane, he dies, right? Hey, you did us all a favor. You showed us the ending. Just kidding. I've got to say that going through those two directors was very valuable, and we should see how not only directors in the 40s but in the future go down the lonely dark road of existentialism, the idea that nothing means anything and everything means nothing, and we shouldn't feel anything really because it really doesn't mean anything, and if it doesn't mean anything, it shouldn't have any attachment to our emotions. And you can see that abstract nature of the dark side of Orson Welles, like in his first film all the way to his last film. And you can kind of see Preston Sturges letting everybody off the hook. He gets everybody in trouble and lets everybody off the hook. And I think those are two really distinct filmmaking styles to be shown in history side to side. All right, we'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you for coming to Masterclass today. We'll talk to you soon.